Just imagine for a moment that you lived 50,000 years ago. The sun has just set. You're sitting around the fire. Your stomach not quite full because the hunt that day was unsuccessful. One of your children is coughing slightly, and you don't know what will come of it. Normally, you think of death in this world as a meaningless end, simply the cessation of a body's functions, nature continuing on without explanation, an ordinary event like a leaf falling. But the truth is far stranger and far more striking than you might think, because at that very time, in an era when survival was so difficult and there was no practical benefit to IT, people began spending hours, sometimes even days, digging into the ground and carefully placing their corpses there. And this behavior was something unprecedented in the animal kingdom up to that point. When one member of a lion pride dies, the others take a look, sniff, and then quietly walk away. Nature is ruthless and entirely practical. There the dead are now useless, not worth expending energy on. So the pride moves on, and life goes on. A similar peculiarity exists in a chimpanzee community. Some individuals may pace restlessly around their deceased companions, touch them, or sniff them, but the body is abandoned shortly afterward and is not buried in the ground. Elephants are a bit different. When they come across a pile of bones, they slow their pace, gently touch it with their trunks, and sometimes cover it with leaves or soil, but they do not systematically dig it up and bury it. Humans, on the other hand, did the exact opposite and did so by spending their most valuable resource, time. So why just humans? Why not horses? Why not cows? Why not other primates? Why not wolves? Why have only humans devoted so much time to such strange, costly, and hard-to-explain behavior? The answer to this question lies at the very heart of the question of what it truly means to be human. And it takes you from there back 100,000 years to a dark, damp cave in Israel. The burials found in the Kafzeh and Skull caves date back approximately 100,000 years a time, long before the invention of writing, long before agriculture, long before cities, and even before Homo sapiens had fully left the African continent. In other words, long before humanity had established civilization as we know it today, people were already burying their dead. But it doesn't end there. It takes on an even more striking dimension, because this behavior, iascent, tionik toous, that is, to Homo sapiens with our intelligent, large brains. In South Africa, in a cave system called Rising Star, the scientific community was deeply shaken in 2013. Homo naledi discovered there a species with a brain the size of an orange, shorter in stature than us, and possessing technology far more primitive than ours was, nevertheless found by researchers to have been deliberately placed in the deepest, narrowest, and most inaccessible corners of the cave, in sections reachable only by crawling down a narrow shaft. A species with a very small brain, one that likely didn't even use fire, was burying its dead in a special way. This discovery fundamentally challenged a long-held assumption in the scientific community, the idea that burial behavior is a product of high intelligence. Maybe it wasn't about intelligence at all. Maybe it was something much older, much more fundamental, much more instinctive. In that case, we need to ask the question the other way around. Why is it so hard not to bury someone? Why does leaving a body behind feel so wrong to us? Part of the answer is indeed very practical. A corpse begins to decompose within a few days, poses a health risk, and can attract predators to the camp. Therefore, disposing of the corpse in some way is a sensible precaution from a hygiene standpoint. But this explanation does not account for why it was buried with such care. It doesn't explain why the body wasn't simply dragged away and left there. It doesn't explain why objects were placed next to it, why the body was positioned in a specific way, such as the fetal position, or why it was sometimes covered in red earth pigment. This is exactly where another, much deeper theory comes into play. Law primatologist Barbara King closely studied the behavior of chimpanzees and elephants in the face of death for many years, and observed that when a herd of elephants comes across the bones of a deceased member even years later, they suddenly slowed their movements, gently touched the bones with their trunks to examine them, sometimes covering them with soil or leaves. And this behavior re-emerges whenever they encounter the same bones again and again. as if a recognition or a recollection were taking place. These are not burials, of course, but they are traces of a capacity to understand death, an ability to feel the weight of loss that stretches back to pre-human times. In humans, this feeling crossed an evolutionary threshold at some point and transformed from an internal emotion into an outward, concrete behavior. One of the most compelling explanations proposed by scientists relates to the human brain's advanced theoretical mind capacities, the ability to comprehend the existence of another consciousness and the fact that that consciousness is now permanently gone. A chimpanzee may see its friend lying motionless, may feel uneasy, or may even be saddened, but it likely cannot grasp the abstract, timeless thought that it will never, ever come back with the same depth of understanding that we do. Once the human brain evolved enough to make this abstraction, death ceased to be merely a momentary absence and became a concept that requires reflection and processing. And the moment you start thinking about a concept, you naturally want to give it meaning. You don't want to leave it hanging. Archaeologist Paul Petit argues that burial behavior actually serves multiple functions simultaneously, layer by layer. First, it's entirely practical, to reduce the risk of illness and unpleasant odors. Second, it's deeply emotional, to allow for the processing of grief and to provide a framework for coping with pain. Third is a layer that most people never think about, but which is perhaps the most important, the social layer. A burial ceremony brings the survivors together physically and makes the answers to questions like who was important, who was valuable to the community, and which bonds need to be preserved, visible to everyone. The jewelry, weapons, and pigments found in a burial are not merely gifts for the afterlife, but also a declaration of who that person was, their place within the group, their status, and their sense of belonging, a sort of first social manifesto of humanity. A 34,000-year-old burial site discovered in the Sungir region of Russia provides truly striking evidence in support of this idea. 2 children were buried side by side, close to one another, along with thousands of beads, ivory objects, and meticulously crafted weapons. The production of these beads alone must have taken thousands of hours. The fact that a community would devote so much time, effort, and resources to the deaths of its own children cannot be explained solely by practicality or hygiene. It is an entirely emotional and social investment, perhaps the greatest expression of love that community can offer. Similarly, a woman's burial site in Bad Dürrenberg, Germany, suggests she was likely a shaman or a spiritual leader, as animal bones, specially selected stones, and symbols were found alongside her. This demonstrates that burial was not merely about laying a body to rest in the ground, but also about recording that person's story, identity, and special place within the community in some way, meaning that long before writing was invented, people were already seeking ways to document and remember the answer to the question, who was this person? Then there's the matter of the red earth pigmenta. Truly strange, truly fascinating detail. In ancient burial sites scattered across the globe unaware of one another and thousands of kilometers apart, the same material appears time and again, as if it were a shared signature. Red iron oxide powder, or ochre, this pigment is sprinkled on the body, around it, or on the objects placed beside it. Why red? Some researchers suggest that it symbolizes blood and therefore life and vitality. Others, however, believe it was chosen simply because it is a very striking, eye-catching symbol that conveys the message, there's something important here. We still don't know the definitive answer. No one is entirely sure, but the fact that the same symbolic choice, the same color, has been selected time and again over thousands of years and across thousands of kilometers is too consistent to be a coincidence, and too meaningful to be a coincidence. Now let's take the story a step further, toward the Neanderthals. For many years, the question, did Neanderthals bury their dead, was the subject of a truly serious and heated debate within the scientific community. Because if the answer were yes, it would mean that symbolic thought, mourning, and ritual were not abilities unique to Homo sapiens, would deal a major blow to the idea of human uniqueness. A Neanderthal skeleton found in the La Chapelle-aux-Saints region of France indicates that the body was intentionally placed in a specific position within a shallow, carefully Dug peat pollen traces were detected around another Neanderthal burial found in Shanidar cave in Iraq, leading some researchers to propose the famous flower burial theory as if someone had placed flowers around the body. This theory remains controversial. Some scientists suggest that the pollen may have been carried there later by the wind or by animals during the excavation, but the very fact that this debate exists highlights an important point in itself. Neanderthals, at least in some cases, did not leave their dead behind haphazardly or carelessly. This raises an inevitable and somewhat unsettling question. If the behavior of burial is not exclusive to Homo sapiens, perhaps its origins lie much further back than we realize in an impulse ingrained in our genes, inherited from a common ancestor in a much more distant past. So, why is this impulse so powerful? And why has it never faded over thousands of generations? The answer likely lies in one of the most fundamental and indispensable needs for survival: group cohesion. Humans are a species that cannot survive alone in nature. The strength of a group depends directly on its members' trust in one another, their commitment to one another, and their ability to act in unison. When a group member dies, the void left behind is not only felt in the heart, not just on an emotional level, but also poses a structural, practical threat. Who will take their place? Who will assume their responsibilities? How will the group recover from this loss? Holding a shared ceremony in the face of death, one in which everyone participates, allows the entire group to experience the same loss at the same time, within the same framework, together, as if they were a single body, far from driving the group toward disintegration and fragmentation. This actually strengthens it and binds its members even more closely together. And perhaps the most striking and most human aspect of this story is that, despite the passage of tens of thousands of years, this impulse remains completely unchanged. Take another look at that Sungir burial site in Russia this time, a little more closely. Two children, side by side, head to head, buried with thousands of meticulously crafted beads, and just think, each of those beads represents the sum of the hours and days spent by a parent, an uncle, or a community, without expecting anything in return. Simply to leave a small token of meaning on the body of someone they loved. Between that person who, 100,000 years ago in the Kafzeh cave, laid a body to rest in the earth with great care, and you, who quietly left flowers at a cemetery last month, there is far, far less difference than meets the eye. The same impulse, tesamenid, the same ancient, profound, and deeply human response, one thing that never changes, no matter how times change, how tools change, or how languages change. It is said that a society can be understood by how it treats its dead, but perhaps the true, full meaning of this saying is that a species can be understood by how it copes with death, and that the human species, for tens of thousands of years, across continents, languages, and religions, has always given the same answer. Now, remember, this story began with the idea that death is thought to be an end. But now you know that, in that dark cave, that first human burying a beloved body with care, without any practical benefit, was actually leaving behind the oldest, most touching message that has reached us. Death is not an end. It is a story to be told, carried on, and remembered, and perhaps that is precisely why, hundreds of thousands of years later, you, too, are still, without even realizing it, silently placing a flower on a grave, continuing that quiet, ancient ritual begun by your earliest ancestors with exactly the same emotion.